Chapter 38 is all about angiosperms, and angiosperms are unique as a group because they form flowers and fruits, and these flowers and fruits protect seeds and often utilize animal partners, mutualists, in either disseminating pollen with sperm inside so that plants can reproduce, so they have animal help in reproduction. And also, they may have animal help in distributing seeds. For instance, animals may eat a fruit and, poop it out somewhere else. Or, those burrs that you get on your socks when you're hiking in the woods, those are fruits. And so sometimes fruits, grab onto animal fur and bring them elsewhere so that they fall off and are planted. So they utilize animals in a lot of ways. And sometimes this means they bring in a bee or a moth or a bat for pollination by offering sweet rewards and colors that attract them. And sometimes you can lure insects in through deception. So if you look at this right here, this is an example of a wasp and an orchid flower, and the orchid flower looks a lot like a female wasp. And so male wasps will come in not to eat nectar, but to copulate with the flower, thinking it's a female, and they go and they do their business, and they get covered with pollen, and then they leave, and then they go see another flower and think it's female and go try to copulate with it, all the while swapping pollen back and forth. But angiosperms are incredibly important, not only because they are the bulk of plants that we see in this world, but also because they are the bulk of plants that are crops for us that help feed us, plants that are important in terrestrial ecosystems as well. Like other plants, angiosperms have life cycles that include an alternation of generations between a multicellular haploid stage, meaning 1N, one set of chromosomes per cell, and a multicellular diploid stage, 2N, or two sets of chromosomes per cell. The diploid stage, the 2N stage, is called a sporophyte because it has sections of cells that will undergo meiosis to produce haploid spores, which will then leave, depending on the type of plant, and maybe grow up into a haploid multicellular structure, which will then produce gametes. And so this haploid structure is called a gametophyte because it makes gametes. The gametes will then come together to form a diploid zygote, which will grow into another sporophyte after fertilization. In some very simple plants, the sporophyte and gametophyte generations are essentially equal in terms of their prevalence in the life cycle. But in angiosperms and most other plants that we see, like gymnosperms, the sporophyte, the diploid 2N sporophyte, is the dominant generation. And the gametophyte has reduced in size and in sort of length of life to the point where it's really only there inside the flower, the female gametophyte, and inside the pollen grain, the male gametophyte. So the angiosperm life cycle is characterized by flowers, fruits, and something called double fertilization in between that, which we'll talk about in a moment. So here you can see the main anatomy of a flower. So every flower is a little bit different, but this is a flower that contains both the male and female parts. Sometimes flowers can be just male or just female, but your male parts are around the outside here, the stamen. And the stamen are made of this long filament and the anther on top. And the anther is where the pollen are produced, which again is the gametophyte, the male gametophyte. And then the carpel is the female part here, and that includes the ovary down here. Ovaries include ovules, which are essentially little sites with eggs that can be fertilized. Sometimes there's one ovule per ovary, sometimes there are many. And then you have a stigma, which is a long stalk that's topped in, a style that's a long stalk that's topped in a stigma, and the stigma is what receives the pollen. So the pollen is formed on the anther, it's received on the stigma, and that will come down here and fertilize an egg in here. Here you can see a pollen grain leaves the anther, lands on the stigma of probably a different flower, forms a pollen tube. And there are cells within the pollen grain. One will form the pollen tube, and then you have a generative cell that will form two sperm. Yes, two sperm. And the sperm will swim down through here. They will find the egg in here. And one of the sperm, which is haploid, will fertilize the haploid egg. That will form a 2N zygote. Excellent. That's what will become the next plant. Now we have the sporophyte, right, that will grow and become the next plant. But you also have what will become the nourishing area, the endosperm, which is also fertilized by a sperm. And it's diploid, so it becomes triploid, 3N. And this grows into the endosperm of the seed that nourishes the growing embryo when it germinates to become an adult plant. The rest of the ovary, you can see, will grow and become the fruit. And there are lots of different kinds of fruit, but they all come from the ovary. So the flower contains four main structures or organs: the sepals on the outside, then the petals, which are also modified leaves, but they have nice colors, right? Surround the reproductive organs on the inside, which include the stamen, which is the anther at top, and the filament that connects it to the bottom. And then the carpel, which is the female organ, which includes the ovary full of ovules or single ovule, the style, and the stigma, which receives the pollen. Sometimes you have a single carpel, sometimes there are multiple carpels fused together, and that's also called a pistil, right, even if it's multiple carpels. So you may have heard of pistil and stamen being the female and male organs of a flower. That is correct. Many flowers contain all four of those floral organs: the sepals, the petals, the pistil or carpel, and the stamen. And those are called complete flowers, but some flowers are incomplete, which means they lack at least one of those organs. Very often, that's lacking either the stamen or the carpel if you have flowers that are specifically male or female. It's called dioecious organism that has separate sexes. Some sexes are monoecious, or some species are monoecious, which means everyone's a hermaphrodite, essentially. Humans are dioecious. Some flowers are too. Let's look a little closer at how these gametophytes are formed. So if we start with the male gametophyte, and we are in that anther, you see microsporangium, or pollen sacs, up here. This is where pollen is produced, and it's produced by a microsporocyte. Now this is a diploid cell. It's just part of this sporophyte. But it will undergo meiosis, and meiosis, as we know, includes two divisions, and it produces then 4 cells. These are each called microspores. And those microspores eventually will develop into a pollen grain, which has a generative cell, which will divide to form 2 sperm, and it has a tube cell, which will form that pollen tube that we'll see go down and allow the sperm to swim through it to get over here to the egg. This pollen grain could look a bunch of different ways. Some of them are adapted to be blown by the wind, like this ragweed pollen grain. Those wind ones are often the ones that cause you the allergies, right? Some of them are meant to get stuck to the backs of bees or moths or whatever. If you look at the female reproductive organs, if we start here, instead of a microsporangium, which is a pollen sac, we have a megasporangium. Again, everything's bigger in females, right? The eggs are just a bigger gamete. So megasporangium, which includes a megasporocyte instead of a microsporocyte. This is 2N, diploid, part of that sporophyte. And then it will undergo meiosis and produce 4 cells, but really only one of them survives. So this is actually a lot like humans, where males, you have one primary spermatocyte that produces 4 sperm after meiosis, and in female humans, you have one primary oocyte that ultimately only ends up producing one functional oocyte because it has to be bigger and have all that cytoplasm. So we have a megaspore, which will end up undergoing some divisions and forming several different cells. So you have some antipodal cells on top that we won't talk much about, and synergids on the bottom. But your egg cell right here, and then your polar nuclei here, this was 2 cells, it's fused, are going to be important. The egg cell, because it's a haploid cell that gets fertilized ultimately by one of the sperm over here to form your zygote, and that is what will grow from the seed to become your next plant, your next sporophyte. These polar nuclei are essentially two haploid nuclei in one cell will also get fertilized by the second sperm. That's why this is called double fertilization, because you have two sperm, one for the egg, one for the polar nuclei. That all fuses, and you end up with a 3N cell up here. So you end up with a 2N zygote, just like you'd expect from sexual reproduction, and then a 3N, what's called an endosperm. And this will end up being, usually in most seeds, what has a lot of energy to sustain the embryo when it's growing. Again, the process of getting the pollen from the stamen to the stigma of the carpel is called pollination, and it can be done by wind or water or animals. There are all sorts of ways to do it. These are flowers that are abiotic, which means they don't need animals. They're just pollinated by the wind, and this is kind of what oak flowers look like. And oaks actually have, I believe, male and female plants, and so you only see this hanging from the male oaks, because these are staminate flowers, as opposed to carpellate flowers, which are the females. And these are ready to receive pollen. These are blowing pollen out. And so if you have a male oak tree near you, the right time of year your car gets covered with pollen and you probably sneeze. If you're pollinated by bees, you may have special bright colors and sweet nectar to attract them, and often in ultraviolet light. They're almost like landing pad or instructions to guide a bee in, because bees can see in the ultraviolet spectrum. But it's not just bees that are pollinators. Moths can often be pollinators, typically at night. And those flowers are going to look very, very different. Blowflies are carrion flies, and a lot of flowers will trick them into coming by smelling and looking like rotting flesh. So not as beautiful as we typically think of flowers being. Hummingbirds drink nectar. That have to have long tubes to keep other bees and stuff out, and allow them to come in and still get covered, by the nectar on their faces without just getting the nectar and leaving. And bats are often pollinators of cactuses, or even if you're a tequila fan, the agave plant is pollinated by bats. And so, for every margarita you have, you should thank a bat. A lot of flowers have several different pollinators, and a lot of pollinators themselves are generalists, which means they can pollinate lots of different kinds of flowers. But in a lot of cases, you have flowers that are only pollinated by a specific pollinator, and vice versa. And in these cases especially, you get these crazy relationships where they evolve in response to each other, and this is called coevolution, right? They're each affecting one another's fitness, and you get these really spectacularly specific adaptations. For instance, Darwin found a particular flower that was very, very long in terms of a tube until you got to the nectar, and he predicted there would be a moth with a 28 centimeter long tongue to get to that nectar, and sure enough, later on, somebody found a moth that pollinated that flower that had a 28 centimeter long tongue. And here you can see the flower and the moth, which pollinates it. And as I mentioned, after this pollination, you end up having a process called double fertilization, where two sperm are produced, are able to move down a pollen tube, and you have one that fertilizes the egg and one that fertilizes the polar nuclei. So of the two cells that are in a pollen grain, one becomes the pollen tube, and it creates this tube, and the other one divides and becomes two sperm, which are each haploid. By the way, that cell that divides is itself haploid, so it divides by mitosis to produce the sperm. And they come down here, and one of these sperm fertilizes this 1N egg to become a 2N zygote, right? The other one fertilizes these two polar nuclei, and those nuclei all fuse together to become a 3N endosperm. And then from here, this is where your seed and your fruit are going to come from. In the next video, we'll talk a little bit more about the production of seeds and fruit.